Helen sat in the back row of the grand hall, her hands gently clasping a folded sheet of paper. It was the speech she had spent weeks perfecting, a tribute to her daughter, Sophie, full of quiet love, precious memories, and unwavering pride. Each sentence carried the weight of sleepless nights, scraped knees, first recitals, and whispered bedtime promises. She had envisioned delivering it with trembling joy, her voice quivering as she looked into her daughter's eyes, just as she used to when Sophie was small and clung to her in thunderstorms. But that moment never came. The wedding venue was a dreamy cascade of white roses trailed across every arch, the chandeliers sparkled like stars, and soft violin strings played beneath the murmur of cheerful conversation. The bride, radiant in lace and light, floated through the room like a vision. Guests smiled, toasts were shared, glasses clinked. But Helen remained unseen. She had not been told she wouldn't speak. No one had the decency to say it aloud. Instead, she found out the way some truths reveal themselves quietly, brutally. There, on a side table near the entrance, was the printed wedding program. She scanned the names: the best man, the maid of honor, a speech from the groom's mother. Her own name was absent. Completely. There was no scene, no confrontation. Helen simply took her seat, just as she always did, poised, respectful, invisible. She smiled when people clapped. She sipped champagne when others raised glasses. She laughed when her heart wanted to break. And in doing so, she upheld something sacred, not the role she had been denied, but her own dignity. No one noticed the quiet ache in her hands as she folded the paper back into her purse. No one saw the tremble in her fingers when she adjusted her dress, or the way her eyes lingered a second too long on Sophie as she danced with her new husband. It wasn't anger that sat heavy in her chest. It was something quieter, more enduring, a deep, hollow absence. The wedding, the very event she had once been asked to help plan, had gone on without her. She had not been invited to the bridal shower. Her handmade gift had been declined in favor of something more modern. The old photo of Sophie's father, her late husband, was deemed too sentimental for the sleek, curated aesthetic. Every gesture of hers had been brushed aside, politely but firmly, until her presence no longer fit. Helen did not cry that night. Not then. She simply watched the people she loved gather in celebration, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that one crucial presence had been quietly cast into the background. And so, while Sophie twirled beneath the golden lights, Helen remained seated at the edge of it all. A mother who had once been the center of her daughter's universe, now relegated to a footnote, if that. She sat in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because the stage that once belonged to her had been quietly dismantled without warning. The speech remained unread, the love remained unspoken. And yet, in that silence, Helen discovered something stronger than bitterness, the grace of knowing her worth, even when others forgot it. She did not make a scene. She did not beg for inclusion. She simply stayed, watched, and carried her quiet heartbreak with the quiet power of a woman who knew what she had given, even if no one else did. In the quiet that followed the wedding, Helen found herself drifting through memories, not the kind captured in framed photographs, but the ones stitched deep into the fabric of her life. Late nights, small hands in hers, whispered bedtime stories, and the scent of Sophie's hair as she slept soundly beside her after another long day of simply surviving. Helen had raised Sophie alone after Thomas passed from lymphoma. She was only 34, still raw with grief, when the doctor delivered the news that upended their world. They had just purchased a little blue house on the edge of town. It had creaky floorboards and a yard too wild for its own good, but it was filled with laughter and hope. When he died, that laughter fell silent, and Helen stepped into the role of mother and father without hesitation. She worked 2 jobs, teaching at the local school by day, tutoring by night. She skipped meals so Sophie could go on class trips. She wore thrifted clothes and never once complained. Not because she was a martyr, but because that's what love looks like: invisible, unthanked, and constant. Sophie once called her the lighthouse in every storm. It was during a thunderstorm when Sophie was 7, trembling beneath a quilt, and Helen had held her close, whispering, I'll always be your safe place. That night, Sophie had written a note in purple crayon. Mom, you're the light when everything's dark. Helen had kept it in her wallet for over 20 years. The edges were soft now. The ink faded, but it still lived in her pocket and in her heart. But somewhere along the way, that little girl with scraped knees and big questions became a woman Helen barely recognized. After college, Sophie moved to the city for a sleek marketing job. The phone calls grew shorter, more rushed. The visits home became less frequent and always scheduled tightly between meetings and dinner plans. Helen told herself it was normal. This was what independence looked like. It was a sign that she had raised her daughter well. And then came Victoria, Sophie's future mother-in-law. Elegant, commanding, the kind of woman who made everyone feel slightly underdressed. From their first meeting, Helen had felt out of place. Victoria spoke in clipped compliments and carried herself like a woman accustomed to making decisions on behalf of others. She believed in control, in appearances, in legacy. Helen noticed the shift almost immediately. Sophie's tone changed. The softness in her voice, once reserved for their late-night calls, had cooled. The stories she used to share eagerly became vague summaries. Busy but good, she would say. I'll call next week. Next week rarely came. The spring trips they once took together, Savannah, the Maine coast, little cabins tucked beneath cherry blossoms, were now distant echoes. Instead, Sophie spent weekends at wine tastings, charity galas, and luncheons where Helen's name was never mentioned. There was no single moment of betrayal, no fight, no slammed door, just a slow undoing thread by thread, memory by memory, until Helen was no longer a participant in her daughter's life, but a relic of it. Each missed call, each overlooked holiday, each polite but brief text was a tiny incision, and over time, those cuts turned into a quiet ache that Helen carried beneath her smile. She never said a word, never demanded more. She just faded, a little more with every silence. In her own daughter's story, she had become a background character, stable, loving, but increasingly unneeded. And yet, even in that erasure, she still whispered the words that had once comforted a frightened child. I'll always be your safe place. But Helen was starting to understand being a lighthouse means shining, even when no one is looking. The ceremony was breathtaking, the kind of event that graced the pages of luxury bridal magazine, chandeliers suspended like stars, floral arches dripping with white orchids, a string quartet playing in soft harmony. The guests arrived dressed in muted pastels and quiet wealth. Laughter floated easily through the air. Helen arrived early, just as the planner's email had instructed. She wore a soft, dove blue dress chosen months ago because Sophie had once said it brought out the color in her eyes. She carried a small, silver-wrapped box under her arm, her fingers resting gently on the bow as if cradling a fragile memory. Inside the box was a L'Occitane heirloom Helen had kept since Thomas passed. Inside were two tiny photographs, one of Sophie as a baby, the other of Thomas holding her, smiling with the quiet pride of a man who had known joy too briefly. Helen had planned to give it to Sophie before the ceremony, a quiet way of including the father who couldn't be there, a bridge between past and present. But the moment never came. When she arrived at the venue, Helen was greeted not with warmth but with polite indifference. A clipboard-bearing assistant glanced at her name and pointed to her seat, second row, far right, not front row. Not beside her daughter, just there. She sat quietly, watching Sophie swirl through the room, radiant in lace and grace, her laughter light and practiced. Helen waved gently when Sophie glanced her way. Her daughter smiled faintly and turned back to the photographer's instructions. There was no mother of the bride dance. There was no private moment to share the locket. Instead, during the rehearsal dinner the night before, Helen had extended the small silver box with trembling hands and said softly, I thought maybe this could be your something old. Your father would have. Sophie interrupted gently but firmly. Oh, Mom, thank you, but I already have my accessories. Victoria gave me a diamond pendant that matches the earrings. You understand, right? Helen had smiled. Of course, she'd whispered, though her voice caught halfway through. She'd tucked the box back into her purse, unopened. And then, the final sting. As the wedding planner took the microphone to announce the evening's speeches, Helen straightened in her seat. She had rehearsed every word of her speech. A simple, heartfelt tribute to Sophie's journey from a girl who danced barefoot in the kitchen to a woman standing tall in white satin. But as names were Reed Best Man, Maid of Honor, and Victoria delivering a toast, on behalf of the family, Helen's name never came. She leaned towards Sophie in a moment of quiet disbelief. "You said I'd give a speech," she whispered. Sophie didn't look at her. "Mom, it just didn't fit the schedule," she said, eyes scanning the crowd. "Victoria thought it would be cleaner this way." Cleaner. Helen felt something cold tighten in her chest. "So, I'm not speaking at all?" Sophie gave a small shrug. "Please don't make a thing out of it." That sentence, so casual, so final, was the cut that hurt the deepest. Helen didn't cry. She didn't protest. She smiled at passing guests, clapped at the first dance, raised her glass when others did. And then, sometime between dessert and the final toast, she slipped quietly out the side door, heels clicking gently on the stone path. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The real farewell had happened long before that night, thread by thread, moment by moment, until Helen had become invisible. The tragedy wasn't that she was excluded. The tragedy was that she had been erased while still standing in the room. The morning after the wedding was achingly still. The world outside Helen's window went on as if nothing had changed. Birds chirped, a neighbor's sprinkler ticked rhythmically, and the sun filtered in through the curtains. But inside, the silence was heavier than grief. She hadn't unpacked her overnight bag. The locket still rested in her purse, unopened. The speech she never gave remained folded in her nightstand drawer, a story no one had heard. She was stirring her tea, more out of habit than thirst, when the phone rang. She hesitated. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't expected. Ethan. Sophie's new husband. She answered quietly. "Hello? Mrs. Taylor." Ethan's voice broke on the first syllable. "Helen. Hope it's not too early. I couldn't sleep. I've been up all night." There was a long pause. All Helen could hear was his breathing, ragged and uncertain. "I'm so sorry," he said finally, his words laced with emotion. I didn't know what she did." Helen didn't speak, allowing the silence to hold him accountable. "She told me you didn't want to speak, that you'd changed your mind." His voice cracked again. "I believed her, until this morning." He explained that after returning home, he had gone through the planner's file. She hadn't been able to sleep, plagued by the image of Helen sitting alone near the back, smiling through what he now knew was unbearable pain. That's when he found it. A printed version of the original wedding, program dated just over a month earlier. Helen's name was there. Speech, Helen Taylor, mother of the bride. He found it tucked in a folder the planner had forgotten to discard. The timeline, the order of events, it was all there. She had been included. Until suddenly, she wasn't. "She removed you 3 weeks before the wedding," he said softly. "Without telling anyone. Without telling me." Helen closed her eyes. The weight of the truth didn't ease the pain, but it steadied her. She had not imagined it. She had not overreacted. She had not been overly sentimental or dramatic. She had simply been erased. "Thank you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan wasn't finished. "I confronted her this morning," he said. "I asked why. She cried, said it was pressure, that her mother-in-law thought it would be cleaner, more elegant, to keep things less emotional. I don't think she even realized what she'd done until she saw your seat was empty at the reception." Helen's fingers gripped the edge of the table. The confirmation stung more than speculation ever had. Sophie had not simply forgotten. She had chosen. She said she thought you'd understand, that you always did. Helen smiled sadly. "That's the trouble with always understanding. Eventually, they expect you to disappear quietly." There was silence on the line. "I just wanted you to know," Ethan said gently. "It wasn't your fault. And for what it's worth, I saw you. I saw how alone you looked. I should have asked. I should have done something." Helen's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. Not yet. You did something now, she said. They ended the call without promises, without plans. Just a quiet understanding between two people who had witnessed the same fracture from opposite ends of the aisle. Helen sat there for a long time, the tea long grown cold. The pain was still there, but now it had shape. It had reason. It had proof. And for the first time in a long while, Helen stopped blaming herself. She hadn't been too much. She had simply loved too quietly in a world that valued spectacle. But now, she saw the truth. And the path to healing, however slow, had finally begun. Helen didn't ask for an apology. She didn't draft long letters or replay conversations in her mind, searching for the moment it all slipped away. Something deeper had shifted. The day after Ethan's call, she stood in her living room and took a long, quiet look around. The furniture hadn't moved in years. The yellow walls, once cheerful, had faded beneath the weight of time. Every corner held a memorysome, joyful, others heavier than dust. It was time, she decided, to make the space hers again. She started by repainting the walls in warm terracotta, the shade her husband, Thomas, used to say reminded him of the New Mexico desert sunsets they always dreamed of seeing together. She moved furniture, repotted old plants, and planted new ones: lavender, rosemary, and wild thyme in the garden. They were hardy, fragrant, and low maintenance. Like her, they had survived harsh seasons. Helen joined a local book club on Thursdays. At first, she was nervous, hadn't belonged anywhere in a long time. But the women welcomed her, not as Sophie's mother or a forgotten wedding guest, but as Helen, a retired schoolteacher who loved mystery novels and always brought the best lemon shortbread. It felt like something small but solid, taking root. Then came the decision to travel. Santa Fe had lived on her bucket list for decades, scribbled in the margins of journals she shared with Thomas. They had imagined art galleries, turquoise markets, and adobe houses under blue skies. Now, she would see it alone, but not as a consolation, as a declaration. She booked the trip quietly. No announcements, no social media posts, just a week to herself. She wandered through clay-stained alleys, browsed paintings, drank coffee in sunlit courtyards, and let herself exist without justification. For the first time in years, she wasn't someone's shadow. She was Helen, standing fully in her own light. When she returned, she made another decision, less visible, but just as profound. She updated her estate documents. Her original will had Sophie listed as sole decision-maker, healthcare, proxy, financial executor, beneficiary. Helen had written it with love, with trust. But love, she realized now, was not the same as responsibility. She replaced Sophie with Claire, her niece. Claire had called every birthday, asked after her health, dropped by with fresh muffins just because. It wasn't about punishment, it was about presence. Claire had shown up. Helen sealed the updated documents with a steady hand, not from anger, from clarity. She didn't stop loving Sophie. That kind of love was bone deep. But she no longer built her days around waiting. She no longer stood by the phone hoping for a call. Her love had become quieter, not smaller, but freer. Sometimes silence is surrender, but sometimes silence is sovereignty. Helen's silence wasn't a door slammed shut. It was a boundary drawn with grace. She no longer lived in the margins of someone else's life. She tended her garden. She chose fresh linens. She laughed with book club friends and started writing again, short essays, reflections, things no one needed to read but she needed to express. There was power in her new rhythm, a quiet, steady rhythm. She didn't demand to be seen. She became someone worth seeing. And for the first time in a very long time, Helen didn't feel like she was waiting to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. The morning was soft with early autumn light. Helen was tending to the lavender along the garden's edge when she heard the sound of tires on gravel, slow, hesitant. She straightened, brushing soil from her hands, and turned just in time to see Sophie step through the garden gate. She wasn't crying. She wasn't breathless or dramatic. There was no speech rehearsed, no grand display of remorse. Just a daughter, standing in the presence of her mother, holding a canvas tote bag close to her chest. "Hi," Sophie said, her voice quiet but steady. Helen nodded. "Hello." For a moment, neither moved. The breeze stirred the rosemary, and birds chirped like it was any other day. Then Sophie stepped forward and carefully unzipped the tote. She pulled out a folded quilt, still wrapped in the same tissue paper Helen had used months ago. "I kept it in my closet," she said. "I wanted to open it, but I couldn't, not until I came here." She set the quilt on the bench beneath the plum tree. Then, slowly, she reached back into the tote and took out a piece of paper creased, softened by time. Helen recognized it instantly. Her speech, the one she had written with trembling hands and stitched together with love. "I read it," Sophie said, eyes lowered. "3 times, maybe 4. Helen said nothing. "I didn't come to ask you to forgive me," Sophie continued, her voice trembling slightly now. "I came because I needed to say something out loud, something I should have said a long time ago." She took a breath, like someone preparing to walk into deep water. "I forgot who I was. And in doing that, I forgot you. I let other voices shape my story, people who didn't know the sound of my laugh when I was 6, or the smell of our kitchen on Saturday mornings. I let someone else write the chapters that should have been ours." Helen studied her daughter's face. There was no self-pity there, no dramatics, just truth, stripped of its ornaments. After a long pause, Helen finally spoke. "You didn't erase me, Sophie, you just looked away." Sophie looked up, startled. Helen's voice remained calm, firm, but not cold. "I was never gone, you just stopped seeing." Another silence. But this one was warmer, softer, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Helen gestured to the bench beneath the plum tree. "You can sit if you'd like. The air smells nice this morning." Sophie hesitated, then sat, folding her hands in her lap. They sat shoulder to shoulder, watching the light flicker through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the quilt between them. It wasn't an embrace, it wasn't an absolution, but it was real. After a while, Sophie reached forward and unwrapped the quilt. She ran her fingers over the patches pieces of old dresses, curtains from their first apartment, the flannel of Thomas's favorite shirt. "I forgot who I was," she whispered again. Helen didn't argue. "You're remembering," she said gently. And for the first time in a long while, Sophie leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, not in apology, but in recognition. Later, when Sophie left, there were no promises made. No, "Let's fix everything." Just a quiet, "I'll see you soon," and a hand lingering on the gate. Helen watched her go, then returned to the garden. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady. They wouldn't go back to what they once were, but maybe, just maybe, they could grow something new, rooted not in obligation, but in truth. And sometimes, that is more than enough.